Hey everyone, I'm Andrew Chesney, Chip Theory Games COO. Today I'm going to be here talking about how to paint the Cloudspire spires. We've got a number of them prepped and ready to go, so I don't know how many of you out there have actually picked up a paintbrush and tried the part of the hobby that is not the board gaming side, but my previous life was in board games industry, so they grabbed me, threw me into the warehouse, so apologies if there's a bit of an echo, but I'm socially distancing film myself, trying to get through a number of different stages. We'll talk about how to prep your miniatures, what to look for in terms of primers, paints to use, and obviously all the different types of brushes. But we'll rattle through some stages. We'll try and get some paint onto the spires, and then see if they can liven up your battlefield that is the Cloudspire universe. So here we have the first one, which is the Grove Tender. This one hasn't been primed. I just wanted to show you this one before we dive into the painting about the preparation that we do. One of the main things you're going to need to do is sometimes clean up some of the mold lines. These things, they're all injection molded, so they're all hard or a semi-hard plastic. And when they come out of the mold, they'll have what's called like a spur. And then these you'll just take an X-Acto knife or any kind of sharp knife, and you'll be cleaning off some of the intrusions that stand out and they don't want to be painted themselves. So sometimes there's an entire line and you'll just scrape down the side of a leg. These ones are actually pretty good, so you've got to be happy with the factory for that. But just like here, we've got a small part where that's come off the mold, and we'll just clean that off because we want that surface to be as smooth as possible when we're actually painting it. And we'll just do that with a knife. You can use a file if you're more comfortable. And then that is your ready-to-go miniature. Sometimes also in the production of the plastics, you can get a slight residue. There'll be an oily substance or whatever. That's absolutely natural. That's what they use to make sure the machines don't stick and the plastic catches fire. If you find that your miniatures have got like an oily substance on them, just wash them in warm soapy water for 30 seconds, not too warm because you'll change the structure of it, but just warm soapy water, and then before you prime it, that'll give you a nice clean surface for the spray to stick to. So I've sprayed some earlier because obviously you need to give the spray time to dry, and I've got a couple of each of the different types of spires. This is the aforementioned Grove Tender one after I've sprayed it brown. And it's quite humid this type of year, so the spray is actually still a tiny bit shiny, but it is dry enough to paint. So this has been sprayed with an undercoat primer, which you can pick up at any hobby shop. You can get them at Lowe's, you can get them all sorts. So usually they're for priming pipes or furniture or things like that. You don't have to spend a fortune on your primer. Some high-end hobby stores do really great quality ones, but I found that your run-of-the-mill $6 can from a local department store or something is usually good enough. So we've got the Grove Tender and the Grige. I've primed in brown, a really dark brown, so I want to be able to dry brush them up and use browns as the base colours. The Airs, the Neuroran and the Braunen have all undercoated in grey because they're mainly stone colours, so that'll give us a really good base to be able to dry brush up and go from there. So I think we'll just grab one. I'll start dry brushing. I'll start going through the different things, explaining the different techniques that we're going to do. I'll put my knife away. Okay, so we'll start with the base coat. So whenever you're painting any kind of miniature, you always want to start with the deepest and normally largest areas first, and then come out and pick out the details after that. The reason is you don't want to nicely pick out the eyes on a miniature like this or some of the leaves on the trees and then use a giant big brush to do the bigger bit and then go over the areas you've already done. You always want to finish with the smaller brushes. You can see here I've got a whole bunch of brushes that we're going to be using, some of which are more stiff bristled. This one is for literally dry brushing on the edge, so you want to get as little paint on here as possible. You dry it off on a towel, and then that will only catch the edges, all the way through to some of the more regular style brushes of different sizes depending on the size of the details that you're going to be painting. Around in front of me you may have noticed, apart from the fact that I have my Plymouth Argyle mug, which I bought in 1990, and I don't think I've had a different painting pot. This is just clean water. It will obviously get a bit more dirty throughout the course of using it, but I tend to be okay for a couple of hours before I change it out. And that'll be what we wash the brushes out with, because we're using acrylic paints and inks. Dozens of different companies out there if you want to check them out, but some of mine are from Citadel and Games Workshop. We've got Army Painter, we've got Forge World, we've got Wargames Foundry, and we've got Vallejo. So that they're all acrylic-based paints, so they're all water-based, and they're all good to mix with each other, and they all get thinned down with water. You don't have to use any kind of white spirit or terps to wash your brush. So this is all done with water, and you will notice, some of you, for the astute ones looking in the corner rather than the miniature, I do have the bad habit of making a point on my brush with my mouth. So you don't have to do that. These are non-toxic paints, so it isn't too bad a thing. But I tend to find getting a point on my lip is the way I get the best for painting. So where do we start? This one, we've got a big tree. The Grove Tender's giant monstrosity has got bark or details down there. We want to find a way of picking out kind of the texture of wood. Now, wood is, obviously, you can have everything from a giant oak all the way through to a silver birch and everything in between. So before you even undercoat, before you prime, you want to be able to know what the final look is. There's no point in priming something brown if you want a grey silver finish. So with this one, we've got a super dark brown, so we're going to go for maybe a mid brown, and then we'll see how light we want to go with the dry brushing, and that's a really good, simple place to start with the thing. So I'll just pick a paint at random. Let's go for one of the drab colours, and they've all got great names, these ones. So let's give these, now some of these paints haven't been open for 15 years, so you'd have to forgive me if they need a bit of work, but here we go. Now what I normally do is get my worst brush, which in this case is this one, and I just dab it in and get a bit of the paint and pop it into there, and we'll see how much of that we actually need. Straight away, wash the brush. I'm not quite Bob Ross level of smacking things on tables at this point, but don't be afraid to have one brush that really does take the brunt of all the work that you want to be doing. So I'm not sure that that's going to be quite dark enough to start. So let's get a bit of, oh, I like this. They've got a bit of a conker brown here. Let's have a look at this. One's a lot redder. So this one is going to give us a nice concrete feel to things. Let's get the brush I'm using to mix the paints and get a bit of that in there. Don't feel like you can't just mix and play with these. The palettes I've got, I think they were 50 cents each, or there was a pack of them at the dollar store. So, you know, these kind of paint palettes are great, and I've actually got a few in a row here just so I don't have to worry about cleaning them out in between every time I use them. So there we go, and I still think that's a tiny bit light, so I'm going to add the tiniest drop of black to this. There we go, literally one drop black. So black and white are the staples of any painting. I'm no artist, but I have been doing miniatures for 20 odd years, and I get through black and white more than anything else. So here we go. So now we've got a real charcoal brown colour coming through with a nice red tinge in there. So that's all. Literally one drop of black changed the colour of that completely and utterly. So I think that is going to be our base colour for that. So let's tap that out. We're going to go straight to the biggest dry brush we have, which is this one. Literally dabbing the ends of the bristles into it, and then taking a bit of paper towel, and it sounds daft, but you're trying to get rid of almost all of it. And then what we'll do, we're going to go against the grain. So we're going to be dry brushing, and the reason it's called dry brushing, as I said earlier, is you're literally getting rid of most of the paint on it, and just being left with a tiny bit. And then what we're going to do is just keep going sideways all over the whole miniature like this. Now, dry brushing is one of those things that it's very, very subtle in its finish. You can, if you go too light too quickly, it'll look really stark and almost wrong in its depth. I think that's probably, it's hard to describe, but you'll know it when you see it. So what you want to do is, rather than doing one heavy dry brush, you want to be doing 2 or 3 lighter dry brushes. And that's kind of the same with the priming. Whenever you're priming with a can of spray, you don't want to go too fast, too quick. you want to give it a dusting and then perhaps do a second coat afterwards, but it's exactly the same with the dry brushing. So here we go with a second one. And again, very quickly, you can see it literally takes 30 seconds to go around the model. And we're all of a sudden starting to come up to a point, hopefully here, where you can start to see it lighten the actual. It's almost like a chocolate color, this one at the moment. It's a really nice thing. So once you've got the base of the dry brushing done, we now want to actually make sure that we're not just painting it that color and we're lightening it up as we go. So what I'm going to do is give this white a good shake, add a touch of white, not too much. There we go. And then I'm going to take my mixing brush and just get some of that in. What I'm going to try and do is give myself enough white left in there that I can keep mixing in a bit of white again and again and again to lighten it up. So let's leave that in there. So let's get some of this lighter paint. We're not using very much of it, so I don't have to worry about that. Let's get a touch more white in there. You can see this beautiful, almost purplish colour coming through as the white mixes with the browns. And so here we go again. So again, this is all the paint that I've taken off the brush. You can see how quickly and how much I'm taking off. So you should be just left with a ever so slight grain on that. And then all of a sudden, as you're doing the dry brushing, some of the details start to pop. So this is the point where you're layering up dry brush after dry brush. You can't do this layer straight away because it'll be quite harsh. It'll look almost white on the base coat. But because we've done that mid dry brush of the lighter or the medium brown, this one is starting to really add some texture. So there we go. So I'm not quite sure what tree this is, but I'm really liking the grain that's coming through on that one. And we can change that up if we want to. So let's add a tiny bit more of the white and almost go to like a stark white at this point. And again, get rid of 95%. Normally what I do, I'd probably give this a couple of minutes to dry in between dry brushing layers, but I'm kind of just showing the process for you guys here. So now we're giving it almost a white. And I'm being really gentle with this final dry brush because I don't want the model to look white. I just want the edges of the detail to just pick up that highlight color. So again, within a 30-second to a minute pass on the miniature, you can see that it's starting to really get a lot of depth. And this is where this is the reason why you start with this this process, because you're catching a lot of the other detail that eventually won't be this color. Make sure we get these protruding roots. In fact, I think that's the name of my spire. This one is Protruding Roots. Nice to meet you. Okay, so that's dry brushing in a brown up through a white. And what we're going to do later on is we're going to pick out the details of the leaves and a few other perhaps bits around the eyes and the mouth. And then we're going to give it some depth with an ink wash. So it won't quite look as stark as this, but I think that's a good job showing that one. So I'm just going to put that to one side. And then I'm going to wash out the dry brush. Now, dry brushes don't do very well if they're still wet, so make sure you really dry these out as well as you can, because otherwise the process will kind of bleed into itself. So I've got a couple of big brushes, so I'll probably use a different brush for the next dry brush. Okay, next up, let's grab one of the stone ones. So again, I want to show you how easy it is to thing. So I'm just going to pinch a bit of white off there because I put a lot out that time. And let's get a tiny bit more of this white. I use so much white, it's crazy. There we go, that's enough white to last us for the rest of the night. So I'm just going to get literal white and I'm going to dry it all off. And then what we've got here is a stone fortress, basically, where, again, 80 or 90% of the model is stone. And with this one, you want to go against the grain, in which case this is both up and down and sideways. And I'm being really gentle. This is kind of not pushing it against the model at all. I'm just letting the brush do the work. And as you can see, it picks out all the stonework straight away. So we can do all the up and down first. And then without actually refreshing the paint on the brush, I'm going to go side to side. So this will hopefully catch all of the detailing that we want to catch. And as the paint wears off uses up. I don't know. Tell me whilst I'm in the comments at the same time what I should be saying. As the paint is being used up off the brush, you can actually go harder and harder, and you can really get to the level of depth of detail that you would like as you're going through. So that literally, and this one is a lot easier than the white. This one is so easy to do that we have literally done all of the dry brushing on this model in one pass. So what I'm going to do next on that is to actually pick out some details, and I'm going to grab a couple of colours that are probably sympathetic to the Braunen range. I think they're probably going to use a lot of leathers and probably a lot of wood. So let's grab this one, and we're going to... This one is what was called an old foundation colour, so these are really thick. So this one is designed to be thick in the bottle to give you really good coverage when you're covering over anything. So if you want to or prefer to undercoat in black, or if you want to undercoat in white, you can use these kind of like foundation colours to cover anything. I tend to shy away from those a little bit. So let's have a look at the leather here. So we've got this giant kind of boulder carrying device. It's a huge crane that allows them to get their ammunition for the lance launchers. And so there we go. So what we're going to do is just cover over all of this leather area, like so. So again, with this one, I got a fairly big brush. I don't tend to use anything smaller than, I think like a 1 if you're looking at actual brush size lists. I tend to find, especially on a model this big, if you're painting the eyes on a tiny 25mm figure, which I don't recommend painting eyes on any miniature for the record, but if you are and you want to paint eyes on something, I wouldn't use something this big. So there we go. So now we have a nice leather. And again, this is really flat in terms of its colour, but it pops. So what we're going to do is we're going to let this dry, and then we're going to add some depth with some ink. With that one in a minute. So before I put this paint away, I'm probably going to look at what other things might be a similar colour. So we've got some kind of almost roof style bits there. They come out and coverings on the doorways and things like that. So I think they would be some kind of lighter wood. So I'm going to give them I'm going to use the same colour as I had for the leather, but I'm not going to leave it that colour afterwards. I'm just going to have that as a base coat. So for me, when you're painting miniatures, you can either do it in one or two ways. You can, plan to paint something for 40 hours and plan meticulously every single tiny detail and use different paints and different layering techniques for everything as you go through, or you can just get some colour on, keep it neat. That's one of the things. There we go, Chesney's top tip. Keep within the lines. So I'm painting the covering here. I'm not being slapdash, I'm not putting it all over, I'm just keeping to it. So the colour is less important than it not going up the stonework. So there we go. Okay, so that is all of those bits done. Now there's a lot of wood and framework on here, so we've got all the supports around the doorways. So why not? I'm just going to dive back into the darker brown that we had for the grove tenders. Maybe it was a grove tender fortress they chopped down to make this one. So I'm just going to come in here, and you can see straight away that now the framing of this door kind of pops out. Again, it's hard when you want to do more natural colours compared to, and this might sound backwards, but very much if you're painting fantasy miniatures, which these are to a point, but if you want a more natural feel to it, you have to be quite conscientious of the colours you're choosing. You want to be able to look at the faction and look at the background and the lore of what it is you're looking at and see how realistic you want the finish to be. If you want something, we'll look at the Auroran Spire in a second, and perhaps we want to do something a bit more fantastical on the Auroran because of their love of the source, their literal worship of the source. So perhaps we'll go with some crazy bright colours for that one, whereas with this one, we want it to be almost sympathetic to its surroundings. And here we go, right. So we have a wooden frame on the crane. So let's give that this wooden colour that we've been using. You can see how quickly through the miniature you can go once you do it. Whenever I've been painting, and I've painted hundreds of thousands of miniatures in my life, the hardest part is the colour choices. Once you kind of have an idea of the colours and the palette you want to use, you can actually just fly through and change from one to the other. So at this point, I'm still pretty certain that this is the direction we want to go with this one. We want to go quite natural, leather colours, something over the awnings, and then the wood. And the last thing to pick out on that will be the metal. So we're almost done on this one. I'm going to kind of finish the detailing on this one early because I want it to dry well enough to show you the inking process, which I won't on all of them, but on this one I will. So here we've got a metallic colour. Metallics are super hard to mix, so I always use kind of as close to the final metal colour I want to use. If I want to use a bright, shiny silver, then I'll pick the right one. I don't want to try and highlight a silver with a white to make it lighter. I want to get the right metal color. So with this one, we've got kind of like a mid-dark industrial metal color. I'm literally just going to put it over the working parts of the crane that are looking like they're metal. There aren't too many on this one. Braunen are quite economical with their use of metal. And I think I'm just to try and get a larger area on there. I'm going to paint the disc that the chip sits in on the top in metal as well. So that's just something for me to be able to like look at them and go, yeah, they're slightly more industrial than some of the other races. They use their giant strength to put these monstrosities together. Try to pin down a Forsaken to do all the heavy lifting. And for those of you that haven't used a Forsaken yet in your Cloudspire games, please do. They are far better than they look, even though usually on wave 3, they're most of your CP. They are absolutely worth every single point. So there we go. Anyway, I'm here for painting minis, not for gameplay advice. Stop distracting me. There we go. So all the way around. So nice and neat, keeping within the lines. Okay, so that is that. Now we said we were going to change the awning colour ever so slightly. So what I think I'm going to do is just arbitrarily again pick a random colour. I'm going to go for this one's actually called drab. There we go. Picking the colours for this video was actually quite hard. I've got well over 1,000 different colours because of over the years you just pick up sets and things. So there we go. Now trying not to pick it up by the wet part, I'm going to mix a tiny bit of the colour that is underneath of the awning, which is this leather colour, and the drab, more pallid colour, just to give it that bit of context and continuity through. And then I'm just going to gently drag it across. Now this is something, and I might be completely wrong in this technique because I'm not a professional, but I call this wet brushing. The reason I call it wet brushing is because it's like dry brushing. You're using the grain of the model, but you're not drying the brush off first. So instead of rubbing it on the towel, I'm literally taking the paint and I am just rubbing it across the model. And in this case, there's some nice contours on the awnings that allow the paint to be captured by some, but not by others. So now we can see the difference between the lighter awnings and the leather of the things. And I think, all bar the shouting on this one will be good to ink later on in the video, and we'll take a look at that in a bit. So let's jump onto something completely different. Let's have a look at the Auroran Spire. So with this one, we've got a couple of different parts to it. We've got to look at something, again, we were talking about earlier, a bit more fantastical in its aura. They love their sauce, although we do have this, whether it's a giant chunk of sauce or whether this is a metal cauldron, that's up to us to decide. So I think I'm going to go really left field and try this like a really, really blue colour. And then we'll see how it looks, and we can always come back and change the next one. They don't all have to be exactly right. So we want a nice dark base blue for this one. So I've got a paint called Necron Abyss, which actually almost looks black when you first take it out of the pot. So let's use this, and let's get a dollop. A dollop is a technical term for an amount that I am not measuring. There we go. And then we will add a tiny bit of this white because it is almost black. And we'll just lighten it up ever so slightly. And because it's so dark, it absorbs the paint. So as we were saying earlier, this is acrylic paint, so it really does just work well with all the other acrylic paints. And you can start to see it soften there with the amount of white. You actually, with these foundation paints that are designed for the base coats, the pigment is so strong that you have to add a lot of another colour to change it. So there we go. Okay. So what we're going to do is we are going to go for a blue stone on this one. So rather than the dry brushing on the Brawnin, what I'm going to do is take a decent sized brush. I could even use one bigger than this if I was thinking about it. But we're just going to repaint over the top of the primer this giant area of stone. So you don't have to be careful at this point because it is obviously, in fact I think I'm going to do that whole band in the middle metal. So there, let's get all of this covered, all down the leg. Here we go. That's a really beautiful, rich, deep blue. There we go. And then we'll come around the side. I'm probably not going to do the entire thing because you don't need to see me do exactly the same process 4 times on every single side. So we'll just come around the corner here. And again, we don't need to be, I'm catching the struts on this one, but I don't need to be careful because they haven't got any paint on yet. So I'll be able to cover those over in a minute with probably a metal colour. I'm trying to think of what I would like to see alongside the blue. All the while, whenever you're adding colours and changing your palettes and thinking about what you're doing, you want to think about the contrast colours. And again, I won't pretend to be any kind of artist, but one thing I have learned over the years is that knowing the colour wheel and what is a contrasting colour and what is I guess, again, tell me in the comments where I'm wrong, what is a sympathetically adjacent colour is really important to making sure that the final result is something pleasing to the eye. You can't always put lime green with bright orange. I mean, you can, but you might not want to stare at it all the time. Okay. So again, I'm not going around the entire model, but now you can see here that really rich blue. Given a bit more time, I'd probably make all of this underneath then as well. But that's a really nice base color for us to be able to go to a way lighter blue. So there we go. So that doesn't take very long to dry, mainly because it's a real high pigment paint as well. So what I want to do with this one is quickly go to the next step, which is changing up and layering the blue that we've got. So here we've got something called vivid blue. And what I'm going to do is not use the paintbrush I should have used, but never mind, I'm started now. So I'm going to add kind of a big dollop of this real light blue and mix it in there with that. And that'll give us like this really strong, almost source light kind of thing. So one thing as well is making sure you're using the same colours across the different factions and across the different things. So if we want source to be this colour blue, then let's stick with that. Let's kind of use it on kind of the eyes of the Grove Tender spire here to give it some kind of like glowing appearance on the eyes there. So that automatically stands out. And I know we haven't done any other details on this, but I've mixed up this colour, so I might as well use it. In fact, let's go another thing. Let's have a really ethereal and put some blue in there in the mouth. So now we can see that, and whilst we're here, we can kind of like pick out some of the divots in there. Let's make it look like the sauce is glowing through the different areas. And what you'll often see with my painting as well is when you're doing this kind of process, don't struggle to get every single bit right. If at this point the base coat is dry, you can just wipe it off with your finger. So let's get a few more of these in there. So for example, if I got like a streak down the side and I think, oh my god, that's terrible, you can literally just wipe it off on your finger, or get a piece of tissue and do that. And at worst, you just dry brush it back over it, but actually most of the time you can just catch it and do that. So now you can see we've got this glowing effect coming through the wood, as if it's about to explode with energy, because obviously everything is made of sauce. Okay, so that was us getting sidetracked by using the same paint for one thing. So that's back to this, and again we're going to use like a dry brushing technique, but without drying the brush off. So just be slightly careful that you're not putting too much on straight away. So we're going to go gently sideways. Now you can see this one puts on a lot more paint than the dry brushing, but it does leave this beautiful kind of highlight color. Again, it catches all the details. It isn't there to flood and repaint the same thing. You really want to be able to see the darker blue underneath. And again, as you kind of do more and more, you can get a bit harder with the brushing as you use up the paint. So we're going to get a bit more on there now, and again kind of get off a tiny bit, but we want to make sure we're catching the edges and catching the details where we want it on the model there. So now we can see nice and bright. Okay, so again, you do that all the way around. In this case, I'm just going to add a bit of white. White is the obvious lightening agent. You don't always want to use white. In fact, again, this is where knowing the color wheel and knowing the palettes is really good. You don't always want to add white. In fact, white to red is a pink. If you want to add a lighter red, you have to do it in a different way. Adding white to a green will make it, I guess it almost like makes it very pastel on a lot of these colors as well. You don't always want to do that. Here we go. So now we've added white to this, and again, if we dry brush off over nice and gently like that. Again, I'm hardly touching the model, but it's putting a lot of effect on the detail itself. So now all of a sudden we've got this real contrast between the lightest part and the darkest part on this model. So what I'm going to do is probably do the metal on this one, just to show you can do a different kind of metals contrast with that, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to do a final highlight on the edges of that, just to show you what the difference in edge highlight makes, and then we'll call that one done as well. So let's grab a different brush. We're going to go in for, this time I want to use a bronze color, mainly because I haven't used it on anything else, and it'll be really great to see how it looks. So again, let's squeeze out a bit of bronze on here. The first one was a bit watery. So what we're going to do is take some of this bronze, beautiful, rich color, and we're going to put it all the way across. So there we go. And again, this looks really flat right now, but once we've added an ink to it in a bit, it'll help. So this is the opposite of the dry brushing. This is actually physically painting the entire of that area in a color and not leaving any of the layer below it show through. So there we go on that one. And I think in this case what we might do is paint the entire of this. Let's go crazy. And again, in any other situation, you'd probably spend a bit of time thinking through how you want this to look. But I love the bronze color against the blue there. So again, I'm not going to go all the way around the model because it's the same on all sides on this one. But here we are doing that, and then on top, I get to decide whether or not I want to go inside the chip area or just kind of catch the top. Now in this case, because the lip is raised on here, it's really easy to be able to turn the brush on its side. Instead of using it down, I'm using the side of the brush to make sure I don't poke down into the chip slot. And then that way we can just do the rim without having to really concentrate a straight line. I've got it on one plane and I'm doing it all the way around like that, so even without holding it on that side. Okay, there we go, that shows you with that. So straight away you can see the difference, making this like really strong metallic statement, the difference it makes to the miniature as a whole. Whenever you contrast colours together like this, you know, I know from experience that yellow and blue are really great contrast colours. Well, this Star Metallic colour has a lot of yellowy red tone to it and hue to it. So I'm kind of like using that to contrast on it. So let's give that a quick rinse. And again, I get through a lot of paper towel when I'm rushing like this. Okay, so what we're going to do is do the final dry brush on this to show the contrast of the white, and then we're going to go back and we're going to ink a couple of the other ones, and then we will be done. So I'm going to get a tiny bit of this white on a very small dry brush this time, get rid of most of the paint, and then again using the edge, rather than stippling it or painting it, I'm literally dragging it across the edge. Now instantly you can see there's like a white, or hopefully you can see that on the camera, there is like a real stark white. Now you don't want to do this on the entire model, so you want to be very sparing with this and just have it for the really hard edges. So here we have it coming down here, we've got hard edges on the legs, and then all of a sudden you've got, you know, after a few literal seconds of dry brushing, got this great contrast between the dark blue in the crevices, the mid blue that we wet brushed, and then the white on the edges of it. And even before we ink the metal on this one, we've almost got a finished spire. So that's great on that one. Just going to go back to the growth tender one, because this is looking really plain compared to what we did on those other ones. So I'm going to pick out the leaves on the trees, because obviously you can't just have a brown spire. So I'm going to get a nice strong forest green, get a bit of that out. And again, this is up to you on how many layers you want to do on these things. I think for me, I just want to have some nice strong colours, and we'll put some depth on it with the ink. But I don't want to spend an eternity painting every individual leaf, which you can do. You know, you really can go in there and do 2 or 3 or 4 layers of green, and it does add to the model. I don't want to say that it doesn't. There is definitely a point to picking out the detail more and more. For example, you don't want to worry too much about the underside of the branches, because when it's on the table, that's all you see. So as you can see there, that is a perfectly, you know, fine painted grove tender tree. Again, this one, I don't want to add white. So if I add white to this green, it's going to be really minty, and we don't want minty leaves. So what I'm going to do is actually take what they've got as a pre-mixed colour, or if I really wanted, I could pick in fact, let's do that. Let's pick an ever so slightly different green, and you can see that it isn't minty at all. It's just light green. So we're going to do a bit of that. We're going to add a tiny bit of the paint we had before, the mid colour, to give it some kind of consistency, and then we're just going to dry brush it down over that. And now all of a sudden again we have some really nice light edges on the trees to give us some kind of depth. And that's pretty much all you have to do on that one. What I'm going to do with this green as well, because again, economy of effort, is to paint the chip. One of the things that I've noticed on this, and this was, I'll show you some of the really nicely painted ones we had professionally done for the company. Having the chip holder almost obviously called out, obviously painted around the sides, means that it's a real big part of the model, and it's not something you're trying to hide. We don't want to pretend that this giant round disc thing isn't here and blend it in, because it is, obviously. So having it called out in the faction's colours is really useful for all parts. So there we go, nice green band around it, like so. Okay, what we're going to do for the final bit is to put some more depth on some of these models and figure out perhaps any of the final details that we may have missed. Don't be afraid of going back and adding some other bits and pieces. So I've got a whole bunch of inks that I like to use. I like to use all the coloured ones over the correct areas, but my main go-tos are in this one they're called soft, strong and dark tone, which is basically light brown, dark brown and black. So let's give this dark tone. Now the different inks will be used at different times depending on the surface they're going over, or the colour they're going over, I should say. If it's like a really grey blue tone, you want to use the black because there's no brown ink in it. If we want to have like the brown areas picked out, we'll use the brown one. In fact, let me pour out the brown ink at the same time. There we go. So then I can go back in between both of them. Tiny bit of water. Again, these inks are water-based. So what I'm going to do, I've got the brown ink on me, so I'm just going to put some brown ink. Now, when I first started using these inks, I was amazed with the amount of work they did that I didn't have to do. So it's almost like cheating. So what we're doing is we're literally just painting over the entire surface area of this leather. Hold on that, and then we're also going to pick out, because these are like a brown tone base colour, we're going to use the brown ink to go over all the framework and to pick out. And what the ink does is it settles in the crevices, so all of a sudden you can see again. It's like everything I do is easy. Anybody can do this. You can see it sitting in the detail, and it just allows you to pick out all of the wood rather than it be soft and that you just put the ink over it and it sits in the crevices and highlights all the work you've already done. So there we go. This one we've actually done the whole model in just a few quick seconds. Okay, so that's all the brown areas done, and we're going to go over to the black area, or the black ink onto the grey areas, and what we're going to do is we're going to slap it on. So this will be a very crude process. You don't want it to go too much onto the brown, so be careful with that. But now, again, you can see the detail, and you can still see the dry brushing through it. So rather than this kind of like pale grey pallid finish from the dry brushing over the primer, we've got this rich dark depth to all the inking going into the crevices all the way down. And then you can see the contrast now between the brown and the black areas. Okay, so there we go. That's again, don't need to do it all the way around, but you can quickly see the difference between the light grey areas that we've dry brushed. They look really nice, but then all of a sudden you've got an ink wash on it, and that will dry matte, not gloss. And you can get a matte and a gloss finishing spray, like a varnish, depending on the finish you like. But you can see all the dry brushing showing through the ink there. Well, hopefully you can on the camera. And then that will be your finished spire to put a chip in. So we've got a couple of other little inking things here just to show you the difference it makes. So the metal band on this one, we said we were going to add it. Now, this is obviously way more of a brown tone than a black tone. So we're going to use the brown ink, and we're going to put it across the entire area of the metal, just here. And again, quite thick, be quite generous with this, and then let it do its job. It will go into all the crevices where you need it to go. And then the same on this giant area here. If we put the brown ink over the whole of the bronze area, you can see it gives it that rich depth. And if it's too much, you can just put the end of the brush in and just take it across. But how pale and not very good it is when it's just a base simple colour, but when you put the ink wash on it, it looks absolutely great. And that's the same for when you've done the different colours on these. So again, I would always use a brown ink on you want the brown tone. We said we were going to give the Grove Tender some love. So here we go, some brown ink all the way around. As long as I don't run out in the pot, let's put a bit more in there. So that's the strong tone. I always find I put too much paint out. It's rare that I put too little out. So there we go. I'm trying to do a lot at the same time. Okay, so again, in and around, and we're just covering all of the area we've painted because we know that this ink is semi-translucent, if that's again right. And the dry brushing and the colours will show through, but the brown ink will give it a completely different contrast. All of the ink is settling into the cracks, it's settling down in between the leaves. It won't cover over the green. It will go down in between the leaves, and it will show you all of the colour contrasting up through and all of the actual paint doing the thing. So now I think from that angle you can especially see that it's kind of nice and rich and deep throughout. And you've still got that. I would actually probably highlight the green around the edge a little bit brighter. It's quite dark for me at this point. Sometimes when paint's dry, they go a bit darker than you expect them to. So always use a lighter paint, especially if you're putting ink over the top. Okay, I think we're just about there. So we didn't touch on the hairs or the Grige spires at this point. I think the Grige one, I would probably dry brush a mid-brown on the barks and then go for a really light honeycomb on these ones, but they're quite samey across the entire thing, so kind of avoided that one. And the Airs one, again, there's lots of stone structure. I think there's a real kind of nice detailing here with the thatch on the roof, which I would probably in fact I could probably very quickly show you. I'd probably use a very similar base coat that we used on the Brawner roofs awnings, put it on there, and then instead of that I would probably just take some of the white and then dry brush across the top, so it's a really nice light thatch on those. And then once that's dry and you've given it the ink wash, the ink will sit in between the straw and make it look like a thatch roof. So there's a real opportunity there. And again, being a bit more fantastical, there's opportunity to do the columns and the doorway and the statues in a really different colour. You don't have to do them in stone. So that's great fun on that one. We've got the Aurora one, which we remember we're doing the brighter colour. If you really wanted to give that a bit more depth, you probably go for a blue ink. Hopefully it's dry enough in the very, very rapid time that we're flying through these models. But just to show you the difference, we'll do, if we put the blue on the lower half of the band, you can see the depth that it adds to this one as well. So you can either keep it like this really light dry brushed up source, or you can add the depth that the ink gives. Either is good. I actually quite like the top one, but I've started the ink now, so I'll probably finish. But you can really use those to layer up and to add all the contrast to the colours. And obviously we've looked at the Brawner one, which we're happy with. What we're going to do is flash up on the screen the professionally painted ones we had around about this time. So hopefully this has given you enough confidence to go and paint this for yourself. These acrylic paints can be picked up from most hobby stores. You don't have to spend a fortune on them. They can run up to, $8–10 a pot, but you can start at some of the $3 for $5 range kind of ones and get some of the primary colours and mix and match what you want to do yourself. It's really great fun. You'll soon find yourself wanting to paint the miniatures from other games if you haven't already, and it really allows the tabletop to kind of like come to life. You're using all these beautiful components, and having painted versions of these spires in your Cloudspire games will hopefully give you more impetus to play more and to get them on the tabletop more. So thank you very much from me. Again, I'm Andrew. I'll be in the comments and see you at the conventions in 2021, and thank you very much for being here.